The stars looked different now than they did 3,000 years ago, but Jake Morrison barely noticed as he stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Horizon. He was a captain in the human space fleet, and his job was to watch for anything unusual in the darkness beyond their solar system. Today, something unusual had appeared. The sensors on his ship were screaming warnings, flashing red lights across every screen and display. Something massive had just emerged from the empty space near the edge of their territory. Jake felt his heart beat faster as he watched the readings climb higher and higher. These were not small objects. These were ships, enormous ships, bigger than anything humanity had ever built. Amy Brooks sat at her station beside him, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she tried to identify what they were seeing. She was young for a lieutenant, only 28 years old, but she was the best analyst on the ship. Her job was to compare new contacts with everything in the human database, to figure out if something was friendly or dangerous. As the computer searched through millions of records, Amy felt a cold sensation spreading through her chest. The computer had found a match, but it was pulling up files from the historical archives, files that were 3,000 years old. The Kethra had come back. Amy showed Jake the information on her screen, and he read it with growing concern. 3 millennia ago, the Kethra had arrived at Earth when humanity was still young in space. They had demanded that humans surrender and become servants to their empire. Humanity had refused, and the war that followed had been brutal and short. In just 6 months, the Kethra had killed billions of people and burned entire cities to ash. Then, without any explanation, they had vanished. They had left through the same mysterious portals they had used to arrive, and humanity never saw them again. Until now, Jake immediately sent a priority message to Mars Command, where Admiral Henry Cole was in charge of all human military forces. The message took several minutes to reach Mars because of the distance, but when it arrived, Henry moved fast. He was 70 years old but still sharp and decisive. He had spent his entire career preparing for threats from space, and he knew exactly what to do. Within an hour, every human ship, station, and defense platform in the solar system was on maximum alert. Crews that had been sleeping were woken up. Weapons that had been in standby mode were powered up. Gates that protected important locations were sealed shut. The Kethra ships moved slowly toward the inner planets, and as they came closer, they broadcast a message on all frequencies. The message was simple and direct. Humanity had 6 Earth days to surrender completely and without conditions, or the Kethra would destroy every human world and station. There would be no negotiations, no compromises, and no second chances. The message repeated over and over in multiple languages, cold and emotionless. Lisa Grant was the commander of the Diplomatic Corps, the department responsible for talking with other species and preventing wars when possible. She immediately requested permission to open communications with the Kethra fleet. Lisa believed that almost any conflict could be resolved through conversation and understanding. She had successfully negotiated with 3 different alien species in the past decade, creating trade agreements and peaceful relationships. But when she tried to contact the Kethra, they refused to respond. They sent the same surrender message again with no changes. They were not interested in talking. On Earth, President Laura Martinez called an emergency meeting with all the leaders of the major nations and colonies. Laura was 55 years old and had been president for 6 years. She had dealt with economic problems, natural disasters, and political conflicts, but nothing like this. She stood in the command center deep beneath Geneva, surrounded by screens showing the Kethra fleet and data from across human space. The room was filled with nervous energy as people talked in hushed voices and watched the approaching alien ships. Laura addressed the entire human population through a live broadcast that reached every planet, station, and ship. Her message was calm but firm. She explained who the Kethra were and what they wanted. She told people about the war 3,000 years ago and how their ancestors had suffered. Then she made a simple statement that would be remembered forever. Humanity would not surrender. Humanity would not run away. Humanity would fight with everything it had, just as it always had when facing extinction. The broadcast ended, and people across human space reacted. There was fear, certainly, because everyone knew the Kethra had nearly destroyed humanity once before. But there was also something else, something the Kethra had not expected. There was determination. There was anger. There was a deep refusal to bow down to anyone or anything. Humanity had spent 3,000 years growing stronger, spreading across the stars and building a civilization that spanned multiple solar systems. They were not the same frightened people the Kethra had faced millennia ago. Chris Palmer was a lieutenant working as a tactical analyst aboard the Horizon. His job was to study enemy movements and predict what they would do next. As he watched the Kethra fleet move through space, he noticed something interesting. The aliens were using the same formations and tactics that were documented in the ancient records. Their ships moved in identical patterns to those used 3,000 years ago. It was as if they had learned nothing new in all that time. Chris brought this information to Jake, who immediately understood what it meant. The Kethra had not changed, but humanity had changed everything. In the 3,000 years since the First War, humans had never stopped preparing for the possibility that the Kethra might return. Every defense system, every weapon design, every strategic plan had been created with one question in mind. What if they come back? Humanity had developed quantum shields that could stop almost any attack. They had built antimatter weapons that could destroy entire fleets. They had created artificial intelligence systems that could predict enemy movements and coordinate thousands of ships at once. They had invented technology that could bend space itself, allowing ships to appear and disappear across vast distances in seconds. The Kethra were expecting to find the same weak species they had nearly exterminated. They thought humans would panic and surrender or scatter in fear. Instead, they watched as human fleets moved into perfect defensive positions with practiced precision. They monitored communications between human ships and heard not screaming or chaos, but cold professional military coordination. For the first time in their long history of conquering other worlds, the Kethra began to feel something they rarely experienced. They began to feel doubt. Peter Yang stood in the deep archives beneath Geneva, surrounded by storage units containing 3,000 years of human history. He was a historian, someone who studied the past to understand the present. The archives were rarely visited anymore because most people preferred to access information through computers and networks. But Peter believed that some knowledge needed to be seen in its original form, touched and felt and experienced directly. Today he was searching for every piece of information about the First War with the Kethra. The military needed to know everything, every detail, every lesson learned from that terrible conflict. The War of First Contact had become something like a legend over the centuries. Parents told their children about it as a warning story, a reminder of how dangerous the universe could be. Schools taught it as history, but many young people thought of it as something distant and unreal, like ancient battles fought with swords and shields. But the military had never forgotten. Every general, every admiral, every commander who had ever led human forces knew the story by heart. They had studied it, analyzed it, and built their entire doctrine around one simple idea. The Kethra might come back, and humanity must be ready. Danny Fisher was a colonel commanding the Outer Rim Defense Fleet, a force of 200 warships stationed in the distant reaches of human territory. Danny was 42 years old and had spent 20 years in military service. He had trained for countless scenarios, fought in 3 smaller conflicts with pirates and rogue colonies, and participated in dozens of military exercises. But everything he had ever done was preparation for this moment. His fleet was equipped with technology that would have seemed like magic to the humans who fought in the First War. The ships had quantum shields that could absorb incredible amounts of energy. They carried antimatter torpedoes that could crack a planet's crust. They used artificial intelligence to coordinate attacks with perfect timing across vast distances. Laura Martinez appeared on screens across human space for the second time in 2 days. The president looked tired but determined as she spoke to billions of people watching from Earth, Mars, Europa, Titan, and 17 other star systems. Her message was carefully crafted to be both honest and encouraging. She did not lie about the danger they faced. The Kethra had more ships and had proven 3,000 years ago that they were willing to commit genocide. But Laura also reminded everyone of how much humanity had changed. They were no longer a single-planet species barely learning to travel between worlds. They were a civilization spanning multiple solar systems with technology and weapons that their ancestors could never have imagined. The speech ended with a simple promise. Humanity would not surrender. The words were not dramatic or fancy, but they carried weight because everyone knew Laura meant them absolutely. Across human space, people began to prepare. Civilians moved into underground shelters that had been built into every colony. Militia forces activated and began moving to defensive positions. Factory stations switched to producing military supplies and ammunition. The entire civilization shifted into war mode with a speed and efficiency that surprised even the military planners. The Kethra were watching all of this happen. They had sensors powerful enough to monitor human communications and track ship movements. What they saw confused them. They had conquered 47 different species over their long history. Every single one had reacted the same way when facing the Kethra fleet. There was always panic. There was always chaos. Governments fell apart as leaders fled or fought each other for power. Populations tried to escape, creating massive refugee movements that clogged transportation networks. Military forces either scattered to protect their own home regions or surrendered immediately to save their lives. But humanity was doing none of these things. Instead, the Kethra watched as human forces moved with practiced precision into defensive formations. They saw ships that appeared to be civilian transports transform into military vessels as hidden weapon systems deployed. They intercepted communications that were calm and professional, filled with technical jargon and tactical coordination rather than screaming or begging. The Kethra fleet commander reviewed the sensor data 3 times because he could not believe what he was seeing. These humans were behaving like a species that had fought hundreds of wars, not like primitives who had barely survived one encounter 3,000 years ago. Chris Palmer was still analyzing the Kethra formations aboard the Horizon. The more he studied their movements, the more certain he became of his initial observation. The aliens were using exactly the same tactics documented in the ancient records. Their ships formed the same geometric patterns. They approached defensive positions using the same routes. They even broadcast their ultimatum using the same frequency bands. It was as if they had been frozen in time, emerging from 3,000 years of sleep with no changes or improvements to their methods. Jake Morrison called a meeting with his senior officers to discuss Chris's findings. The implications were enormous. If the Kethra truly had not advanced in 3 millennia, then humanity had a massive technological advantage. But Jake was cautious. He had been a military officer long enough to know that overconfidence killed more soldiers than enemy weapons. Just because the Kethra were using old tactics did not mean they were stupid or weak. Their ships were still enormous and heavily armed. Their weapons had been powerful enough to destroy cities 3,000 years ago. Even with superior technology, humanity would need to fight smart and avoid unnecessary risks. Amy Brooks discovered something interesting while analyzing the Kethra ship designs. The vessels looked identical to those documented in the historical records, but her sensors were detecting some unusual energy signatures. It appeared that the Kethra ships were running on some kind of suspended animation technology. The crews inside might have been asleep for most of the 3,000 years, only waking up recently to resume their conquest. This would explain why their tactics had not changed. From the Kethra perspective, only a short time had passed since they last fought humans. They did not know that humanity had spent 3 millennia preparing for their return. Danny Fisher received new orders from Admiral Henry Cole. The Outer Rim Defense Fleet was to move to the Neptune Defense Line, a series of fortifications and weapons platforms built in the outer solar system. Neptune had been chosen as the first major defensive position because it gave human forces room to maneuver while protecting the inner planets. If the Kethra wanted to reach Earth or Mars, they would have to go through Danny and his 200 ships. It was not a large force compared to the thousands of vessels in the alien fleet, but Danny was confident. He had trained his crews well, and they had weapons that could destroy enemy ships much larger than their own. Lisa Grant had not given up on diplomacy despite the Kethra rejection of her initial contact attempts. She believed that every intelligent species could be reasoned with if you understood their perspective and motivations. Lisa spent hours reviewing everything known about Kethra culture and psychology from the ancient records. She discovered that they were a hierarchical society that valued strength and despised weakness. They had built their empire by conquering species they considered inferior and forcing them to serve. The Kethra measured worth by military power, and they only respected those who could fight back effectively. This gave Lisa an idea. Perhaps the Kethra would only negotiate if humanity first proved it could not be easily conquered. If human forces could inflict serious damage on the alien fleet, the Kethra might be willing to talk rather than waste resources on a difficult war. Lisa presented this theory to Laura Martinez and Henry Cole. The president was skeptical, but agreed it was worth considering. The admiral was more direct. He said that humanity would prove its strength regardless of whether it led to negotiations, because the alternative was extinction. The seventh day arrived and the Kethra attacked exactly as they had promised. 5,000 warships emerged from their holding position and accelerated toward the Neptune defense line where Danny Fisher's fleet waited. The alien vessels were massive, each one 3 times the size of the largest human battleship. Their hulls were dark gray metal that seemed to absorb light, and they moved in perfect geometric formations that looked beautiful and terrifying at the same time. As they approached, the Kethra ships began charging their weapons. Energy readings spiked across every sensor as plasma cannons powered up, the same weapons that had melted Earth's cities 3,000 years ago. Danny stood on the bridge of his flagship, a heavy cruiser called the Defender. Around him, his crew worked at their stations with focused intensity. Nobody spoke unless necessary. Everyone knew their job and trusted each other to perform. Danny had drilled them endlessly for this moment, running simulations and exercises until the responses became automatic. Now all that training would be tested against a real enemy that wanted to kill them. He watched the tactical display as the Kethra fleet came closer, waiting for the right moment. Timing would be everything in this battle. The Kethra opened fire when they reached their maximum effective range. Thousands of plasma bolts streaked across the darkness, bright green spheres of superheated matter that could vaporize anything they touched. The human crews watched the incoming fire on their screens, and some of the younger officers felt fear creep into their hearts. But the veterans remained calm. They had faith in their technology and their preparations. The plasma bolts struck the quantum shields protecting the human ships, and the shields held. The impacts created brilliant flashes of light as energy was absorbed and redirected, but none of the ships took damage. The Kethra weapons that had once been unstoppable were now ineffective. Danny gave the order to return fire, and the human fleet unleashed everything it had. Railguns mounted on every ship fired metal projectiles accelerated to a fraction of light speed. These were not explosive weapons. They were simply solid chunks of metal moving so fast that they hit with the force of nuclear bombs. The projectiles crossed the distance between the fleets in seconds and began tearing through Kethra hulls. The alien ships had armor, but it was designed to stop energy weapons like their own plasma cannons. The armor was useless against kinetic impacts traveling at relativistic speeds. The first volley destroyed 80 Kethra ships, punching through them like paper. The Kethra fleet hesitated, their perfect formations breaking apart as commanders tried to understand what had just happened. They had expected human weapons to be primitive and weak, similar to what they remembered from the First War. Instead, they were facing weapons that could destroy their ships with single hits. Before they could reorganize, the second wave of human attacks arrived. Antimatter missiles launched from the human ships, each one guided by its own artificial intelligence system. The missiles were small and fast, almost impossible to track or intercept. When they struck Kethra vessels, they detonated with the power of small stars, releasing energy equivalent to dozens of nuclear warheads. The Kethra tried to adapt. Their ships began evasive maneuvers, breaking formation to make themselves harder to target. They increased their rate of fire, sending more plasma bolts at the human fleet in hopes of overwhelming the shields. Some of their shots did break through, damaging human ships and killing crew members. But for every human vessel that took damage, 10 Kethra ships were destroyed. The exchange rate was devastatingly in humanity's favor. After 1 hour of combat, the Kethra had lost 300 ships while only destroying 12 human vessels. Then the drone swarms arrived. These were another weapon the Kethra had no knowledge of. Each human ship carried hundreds of small combat drones, autonomous machines controlled by artificial intelligence. The drones were released in massive clouds that surrounded enemy vessels. They were too small and numerous for the Kethra point defense systems to stop effectively. Once attached to a ship's hull, the drones would cut through armor with plasma torches or plant explosive charges on critical systems. The Kethra crews watched in horror as their ships were torn apart by swarms of machines that seemed to think and coordinate like living creatures. Jake Morrison had moved the Horizon into position for a flanking attack. While the main Kethra fleet was focused on Danny's forces at Neptune, Jake had used his ship's jump drive to appear behind enemy lines. With him were 30 other ships, all equipped with the same advanced jump technology. Kevin Shaw was Jake's tactical officer, a young lieutenant with a gift for three-dimensional thinking. Kevin had calculated the jump coordinates perfectly, placing the human force in an ideal position to attack the Kethra rear formations. The enemy ships were facing the wrong direction when Jake's force opened fire, and they died without ever seeing what killed them. The Kethra fleet tried to turn and engage Jake's force, but this exposed their flanks to Danny's ships. It was a classic pincer movement, a tactic that had been used in warfare for thousands of years. The Kethra were caught between two human forces and taking fire from multiple directions. Their formations collapsed completely as individual ships tried to defend themselves. Some attempted to flee back toward the outer system, but the human ships were faster and hunted them down. Others tried to push forward toward Neptune, hoping to at least accomplish something before they died. But Danny's defense line held firm. 3 hours after the battle began, it was effectively over. The Kethra had lost 800 ships, more than 15% of their attacking force. The remaining vessels retreated in disorder, abandoning their formation and fleeing as fast as their engines could manage. The humans could have pursued and destroyed more, but Danny ordered his fleet to hold position. He did not want to chase the enemy into unknown space where they might have reinforcements waiting. Better to secure the victory they had won and prepare for the next attack. Henry Cole watched the battle from Mars Command, monitoring sensor feeds and casualty reports. The human losses were lighter than he had feared. 27 ships destroyed, another 45 damaged but repairable, approximately 4,000 crew members killed, with another 6,000 wounded. Every death hurt, but Henry had expected much worse. The Kethra had come with overwhelming numbers and weapons that had once destroyed entire cities. The fact that humanity had defeated them with relatively light casualties proved how much had changed in 3,000 years. Sophie Lane worked frantically aboard the hospital ship Mercy, treating wounded crew members evacuated from damaged vessels. She was a doctor specializing in combat trauma, and she had seen terrible injuries during her career. The wounded coming from the battle included burn victims from plasma fire that had penetrated shields, crew members with broken bones from impact collisions, and others suffering from radiation exposure. But modern medical technology could save people who would have died in the ancient war. Regeneration treatments could rebuild damaged tissue. Nanomedicine could repair injuries at the cellular level. Sophie and her team worked around the clock, and they saved 90% of the wounded who reached their ship. The Kethra fleet commander sat in his command center, reviewing the battle data with growing disbelief. He had personally led campaigns that conquered a dozen worlds. He had never experienced a defeat like this. The humans had not simply fought well. They had completely dominated the engagement, destroying ships faster than his sensors could track. The fleet commander realized that the old records were worse than useless. They had given the Kethra a false picture of what humanity was capable of. These were not primitives. These were warriors with technology that matched or exceeded the Kethra's own capabilities. The fleet commander sent a message back to his superiors, the Kethra High Council that directed the Empire's military operations. He reported the defeat honestly and explained that conquering humanity would require far more resources than originally planned. He recommended committing the full armada, every ship and weapon the Kethra possessed. The High Council reviewed his message and made their decision. They had invested 3,000 years of travel to reach this system. They had nowhere else to go, no backup plan if this invasion failed. They would commit everything they had. The real war was about to begin. The Kethra brought everything they had. 12,000 warships moved into the solar system, supported by enormous siege platforms designed to bombard planets from orbit. The sheer size of the fleet was overwhelming, a dark cloud of metal that blocked out the stars. They had learned from their first defeat and changed their tactics. Instead of attacking the outer defenses where humanity was strongest, they used their jump technology to bypass Neptune entirely. The alien fleet appeared suddenly in the inner solar system, striking directly at the colonies on Mars, Europa, and Titan. Orbital bombardment began immediately, with plasma cannons firing down at cities and bases. But humanity had prepared for exactly this scenario. Every colony built in the past 3,000 years had been designed with invasion in mind. The cities were not on the surface where they would be vulnerable to orbital fire. Instead, they were deep underground, buried beneath kilometers of rock and reinforced metal. When the Kethra plasma bolts struck, they hit empty structures and abandoned defensive positions. The civilians were safe in shelters that could withstand anything short of cracking the entire moon or planet. The Kethra were wasting ammunition on targets that did not matter. Tyler Ross was a sergeant in the Colonial Defense Forces on Titan. He was 31 years old and had grown up on the moon, playing in the methane lakes and ice formations as a child. Now he was leading a squad of 20 soldiers in defense of his home. When the Kethra ships appeared in orbit, Tyler and his team were already in position in the frozen landscape. They watched as alien dropships descended through the orange atmosphere, carrying ground forces to secure the colony. The Kethra expected to find civilians in panic and defenders overwhelmed by superior numbers. Instead, they found organized militias armed with weapons specifically designed to kill aliens. The Kethra ground forces were formidable. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, with 4 arms and thick armored hides that could stop regular bullets. They had fought on dozens of worlds and conquered species that seemed unbeatable, but they had never fought humans on human territory. Tyler's squad used the methane lakes as cover, hiding beneath the liquid surface with breathing equipment. When Kethra troops walked past, the humans emerged and attacked from behind. They used weapons that fired explosive rounds designed to penetrate alien armor. They set traps using the natural features of Titan's landscape. They struck fast and then disappeared back into the frozen terrain before the enemy could respond. This pattern repeated across every human colony. The Kethra landed ground forces expecting easy victories, and instead found themselves in brutal guerrilla warfare against defenders who knew every tunnel, every hiding spot, every advantage the terrain could provide. On Europa, human forces used the subsurface ocean to move between positions. On Mars, they hid in the vast canyon systems and struck from ambush. The Kethra had superior numbers, but numbers meant less when you could not find your enemy or protect your supply lines. In space, Jake Morrison's fleet fought a desperate running battle against overwhelming odds. The Horizon and 50 other ships were playing a dangerous game of hit and run, jumping in to strike at Kethra forces and then disappearing before the enemy could respond in strength. Amy Brooks was working non-stop at her navigation station, calculating jump coordinates with split-second precision. Every jump had to be perfect because a mistake would leave them trapped in normal space, where the Kethra could surround and destroy them. Amy's hands moved across her controls, her mind processing calculations faster than most computers. She had not slept in 30 hours, surviving on stimulants and pure determination. The Kethra were learning to predict human jump tactics and setting up ambushes at likely arrival points. Twice Jake's fleet emerged from jump space to find enemy forces waiting for them. The battles were vicious and cost human lives, but Jake always managed to jump away before his ships were completely destroyed. He was losing vessels steadily, down to 38 ships from his original 50, but he was tying down hundreds of Kethra vessels that could not be used elsewhere. Every enemy ship chasing Jake was one less ship bombarding colonies or attacking other human forces. Lisa Grant was still working on understanding the Kethra, even as the war raged around her. She had teams of linguists and psychologists analyzing every alien communication they could intercept. What she discovered was shocking. The Kethra were not conquering humanity because they wanted slaves or resources. They were doing it because they had no choice. Lisa found references in their communications to something called the Great Dying. The Kethra homeworld was failing, its sun entering a phase that would make the planet uninhabitable within a few generations. They had spent 3,000 years in suspended animation aboard their ships, searching for a new world they could claim. This information changed everything. Lisa immediately shared her findings with Laura Martinez and Henry Cole. The president saw potential for a negotiated settlement if the Kethra could be offered an alternative to conquering Earth, but Henry was skeptical. He pointed out that the Kethra had many options. They could have asked humanity for help or proposed sharing territory. Instead, they had chosen genocide. Their desperation might explain their actions, but it did not excuse them or make them any less dangerous. Danny Fisher was fighting the largest space battle in human history near Jupiter's orbit. His outer rim defense fleet had been reinforced with ships from Earth and was now engaging the main Kethra armada. The battle had been going on for 6 hours with no clear winner. Human ships were faster and had better weapons, but the Kethra had numbers. For every alien vessel destroyed, 2 more moved up to take its place. Danny was exhausted, his uniform soaked with sweat, his voice hoarse from giving orders, but he could not stop. If his fleet broke, the Kethra would have a clear path to Earth. Peter Yang was still in the archives, searching for any information that might help. He found an interesting detail in the ancient records. 3,000 years ago, the Kethra had retreated suddenly without explanation. There was no record of what caused them to leave, no clear reason why they had abandoned a war they were winning. Peter wondered if whatever drove them away might still be relevant. He shared his findings with military intelligence, hoping someone could make sense of it. But there was no time for deep historical research. The war was happening now, and answers needed to be found quickly. On Earth, preparations were being made for ground defense. Nobody believed the Kethra would succeed in conquering the colonies, but there was a real possibility they might try to land on humanity's homeworld. Underground military bases came online, revealing weapon systems that had been hidden for centuries. Massive railgun installations rose from beneath the surface, capable of shooting down ships in orbit. Missile silos opened, containing antimatter warheads that could destroy entire fleets. Earth had been turned into a fortress over 3 millennia, and now those defenses would be tested. Sophie Lane's hospital ship was overwhelmed with casualties. The Mercy had been designed to handle hundreds of wounded, but thousands were arriving from the battles across the solar system. Sophie had not left the operating room in 2 days. She had performed surgery on 73 patients, saved most of them, and lost a few despite her best efforts. Each death hurt, but she could not afford to dwell on losses. There were always more wounded arriving, more people who needed her skills to survive. Her team of doctors and nurses were equally exhausted, working beyond what should have been humanly possible. The war ground on with no end in sight. Both sides were taking terrible losses. The Kethra had lost 3,000 ships, a quarter of their total fleet. Humanity had lost 500 vessels and seen dozens of colonies damaged. Millions of people had died, both military and civilian. The fighting was spreading across the entire solar system, with battles happening simultaneously at multiple locations. It was chaos, a desperate struggle where both sides were fighting for survival. The Kethra could not afford to retreat because they had nowhere to go. Humanity could not surrender because surrender meant extinction. Laura Martinez barely slept, spending her time coordinating the war effort and trying to maintain civilian morale. She made broadcasts every few days, updating the population on the war's progress. She was honest about the costs, but always emphasized that humanity was holding its ground. The Kethra were strong, but they were not invincible. Every day humanity endured was another day closer to victory. People across human space drew strength from her words and continued to fight, work, and sacrifice. They would not give up. They would endure, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. The final battle began above Earth itself. The Kethra had committed their remaining forces to one desperate assault, determined to break humanity's will by threatening the homeworld. 9,000 alien warships moved into position around the planet, their weapons charged and ready. This was everything they had left after weeks of brutal fighting across the solar system. If they failed here, the Kethra would have nothing. But they believed that humans would surrender, rather than risk Earth's destruction. They were wrong. Jake Morrison had anticipated this moment. For days he had been pulling ships from across the solar system and positioning them in hiding spots near Earth. He had vessels tucked behind the moon, others waiting in Earth's shadow, and more ready to jump in from nearby positions. When the Kethra fleet arrived, they thought they were facing only the permanent defense platforms and a few dozen ships. They did not realize they were walking into a trap. As soon as the alien fleet was fully committed, Jake gave the signal and every hidden human ship activated at once. The battle was like nothing ever seen before. Thousands of ships fighting in close quarters around a planet, weapons firing in every direction, explosions lighting up space like a second sun. The quantum shields of human vessels glowed constantly as they absorbed plasma fire. The antimatter missiles left trails of light across the darkness. The railgun projectiles moved too fast to see, only their impacts visible as Kethra ships shattered and broke apart. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a dance of destruction playing out above humanity's birthplace. Kevin Shaw was working his station aboard the Horizon, coordinating attacks with split-second timing. He was routing power, targeting enemies, and managing defensive systems all at once. His hands moved faster than conscious thought, driven by training and instinct. Then the Horizon took a direct hit from 3 plasma cannons firing simultaneously. The shields held for 2 seconds before collapsing, and the plasma burned through the hull into the ship's power core. Kevin saw what was happening and reacted instantly. He manually rerouted all remaining power to the shields protecting the bridge and crew areas, while letting the reactor overload. His actions saved 300 people, but he did not survive the explosion. His last thought was satisfaction that his crew would live. On Titan, Tyler Ross was in his final battle. The Kethra had committed their remaining ground forces to taking the colony, and Tyler's squad was holding a critical choke point that protected the civilian shelters. They had been fighting for 16 hours straight, and ammunition was running low. Tyler had lost 12 of his 20 soldiers, and the rest were wounded or exhausted. But they could not retreat because thousands of civilians were behind them. When the Kethra troops finally overwhelmed their position, Tyler detonated the explosives they had placed throughout the tunnel system. The explosion killed him and his remaining squad members, but it also buried 200 Kethra soldiers and bought time for reinforcements to arrive and secure the colony. Sophie Lane died trying to save lives. Her hospital ship was attacked by a Kethra vessel that targeted it deliberately despite medical markings. The attack was against every law of warfare, but the Kethra were desperate and no longer cared about such things. Sophie had 3 minutes of warning before the missiles hit. She used that time to evacuate as many patients as possible, loading them into escape pods and launching them toward nearby human ships. She stayed at her station until the last pod was away. Then the missiles struck and the Mercy was destroyed. Of the 200 people aboard, Sophie saved 173. She was not among the survivors. The battle above Earth lasted 18 hours. It was the longest sustained combat engagement in human history. Both sides fought with everything they had, neither willing to give up or retreat. Human ships rammed Kethra vessels when they ran out of ammunition. Kethra crews fought to the last soldier when their ships were boarded. The casualties were horrific on both sides, but slowly, inevitably, the tide turned in humanity's favor. The human forces were defending their homeworld, fighting with a desperation and determination that the Kethra could not match. And humanity still had reserves, ships held back as a final defense, while the Kethra had committed everything. The Kethra flagship was the largest ship in their fleet, a massive vessel that served as both a warship and a command center. Jake Morrison led a strike force of 12 ships in an attack on the flagship, knowing that killing the enemy commander might break the alien fleet's morale. The flagship was heavily defended with hundreds of smaller vessels protecting it, but Jake's force punched through using focused antimatter strikes. The horizon was badly damaged, trailing atmosphere and burning from multiple hits, but Jake kept pressing forward. When they reached firing range, every ship launched everything they had at the flagship. The Kethra flagship's shields collapsed under the barrage, and antimatter torpedoes struck the hull in a dozen places. The explosions tore through the vessel's structure, destroying critical systems and killing thousands of crew members. The flagship began to fall toward Earth, its engines dead and its hull breaking apart. The Kethra fleet commander had just enough time to send one final message before his ship entered the atmosphere. He acknowledged defeat and transmitted data files containing maps of known alien species, star charts, and warnings about other dangers in the galaxy. His last words were a warning that humanity had proven itself strong, and strength attracted attention. Others would come, drawn by humanity's presence in space. As the flagship burned in Earth's atmosphere, the remaining Kethra ships began to surrender. Some tried to flee, but they were hunted down by human forces. Others simply stopped fighting and waited to be captured. The battle was over. Humanity had won, but the cost had been terrible. 2,000 human ships destroyed, 50,000 military personnel killed, 20 million civilians dead from orbital bombardments and ground fighting, entire colonies damaged and requiring years of rebuilding. The victory was real, but it did not feel triumphant. Laura Martinez stood in the ruins of an orbital defense station, looking down at Earth through a viewport. The planet bore new scars adding to the old ones from 3,000 years ago. Cities had been damaged again. Landscapes had been burned again. But Earth endured, just as humanity endured. Laura felt exhausted beyond words, but also relieved. They had survived, against terrible odds with an enemy that wanted to exterminate them. Humanity had fought back and won. Lisa Grant was already working with the captured Kethra survivors, beginning the difficult process of understanding what would happen next. Some humans wanted to execute all the aliens as revenge for the war. Others wanted to imprison them permanently. But Lisa advocated for a different approach. The Kethra were a dying species with nowhere to go. Perhaps they could be resettled on an uninhabited world in human space, allowed to rebuild under human supervision. It would be a form of mercy, but also practical. Living Kethra could provide valuable information about other alien species and threats in the galaxy. The captured alien databases were proving incredibly valuable. The Kethra had been exploring and conquering for thousands of years before they went into suspended animation. Their records contained maps of vast regions of space, information on hundreds of alien species, and details about dangers humanity had never imagined. Peter Yang spent days reviewing the data, realizing that humanity's view of the universe was about to expand dramatically. They were not alone, and the galaxy was more crowded and dangerous than anyone had believed. Henry Cole was planning the next phase of human military development. The war with the Kethra had revealed weaknesses that needed to be addressed. Humanity needed more ships, better weapons, and expanded defenses. They also needed to explore farther and faster, to find potential allies before hostile species found them. Henry proposed a massive expansion of the space fleet and the establishment of military bases in neighboring star systems. The cost would be enormous, but the alternative was being caught unprepared again. Jake Morrison was promoted to admiral for his actions during the war. He was given command of humanity's first deep space exploration fleet, a force of 100 ships designed for long-range missions. Jake's orders were to explore beyond human space, make contact with other species, assess threats, and establish forward bases. It was a dangerous mission that would keep him away from Earth for years. But Jake accepted without hesitation. Someone had to go out and ensure humanity would never again be surprised by alien invasions. Danny Fisher survived the war and returned to his duties. Commanding the Outer Rim Defense Fleet, he had lost half his ships and thousands of crew members, but he had held the line when it mattered most. Danny spent his time after the war training new officers and sharing the lessons learned from fighting the Kethra. His experience was invaluable, and he made sure that future generations of human soldiers would be even better prepared than his own. Amy Brooks continued working as a tactical analyst, but she was haunted by the war. She had watched too many friends die, made too many calculations that sent people into danger. She took a leave of absence after the fighting ended, returning to Earth to spend time with her family and recover from the trauma. Eventually,